All this leads me to the second and central section of this lecture, in which I want to suggest that the assumed standoff between what we call religion and what we call the secular world, and the cultures which have grown up around this standoff, are radically misconceived, and that there are other ways of looking at the whole thing which would be more accurate in description, more helpful in enabling us to find our way forward, and indeed more Christian in their conformity to the interesting and often forgotten message about Jesus himself. So to the second section of my lecture, what happened to the gods? One of the things you learn early on in science is that nature abhors a vacuum. You can create a vacuum, you can sustain it given the right technology, but atmospheric pressure always threatens to break back in, and sometimes it will cause an explosion. Something similar is true with philosophies and worldviews. They abhor a vacuum. You can push God or the gods away upstairs out of sight, like an elderly, embarrassing relative. You go and live upstairs, they're there. But history shows again and again that other gods quietly, or sometimes noisily, sneak in to take their place. And these other gods are not strangers. The ancient world knew them quite well. Just to name three most obvious. There is Mars, the god of war. There is Mammon, the god of money. And there is Aphrodite, the goddess of erotic love. One of the fascinating things about modern Western ideas has been the work of the masters of suspicion, Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, claiming to reveal the motives that lie beneath the outwardly smooth and comprehensible surface of the Western world. It was all about power, declared Nietzsche. No, everything comes down to money, said Marx. It's all about sex, said Freud. And in each case, these were seen as forces or drives that were there whether we liked it or not. We might imagine we are free to choose, but in fact we are the blind servants of these impulses. Take them in reverse order. It's hard now, actually, to imagine the world of the 1950s, when I was a child. There was more or less no pornography. The great majority of married couples stayed married. When I was at school, I knew precisely one boy who came from a broken home. No doubt a great deal of what was seen as illicit sexual activity went on below the radar, but a broadly Judeo-Christian moral stance was assumed in society, which meant, importantly for the story I'm telling, that most people felt under at least some pressure to resist impulses which, left to themselves, would have moved in a very different direction. But when Freud became popular, filtering down into mainstream culture in novels and plays, people began to speak of the erotic impulse, often called the life force, precisely in the way that they might, centuries before, have spoken of a divine command. One should not resist. One could not resist. It would be hypocritical and wrong. I don't think people any longer speak reverently about the life force in that way. It's just assumed. The late Christopher Hitchens, another high priest of contemporary atheism, said that there were two things you should never pass up an opportunity to do. One was to appear on television, and the other was to have sex. The goddess Aphrodite, even if unnamed, is believed in and served by millions. Second, Mammon. You in America hardly need me to tell you about the place of Mammon, of the worship of money in our society. But Britain, or at least London, has prided itself on being the financial capital of the world, and the major financial scandals and banking crises that have shaken our system over the last decade have done nothing to damage our faith in this ancient and yet very modern God. We still assume that though something has gone horribly wrong, the only thing to do is to shore up this idol and get it going again, despite the gross inequities in our own Western world, the countries still suffering from unpayable debt, the rising tide of poverty in all sorts of unexpected places, and so on. Perhaps it wouldn't be straining the point to say that many students now still hope, rightly or wrongly, that a degree will be a passport to a good job and hopefully a good salary, and one feels that's justification enough. As long as it gets me into some money, that'll be all right. But you can recognize the worship of Mammon precisely at the point when somebody asks you to do a job for which you will be paid considerably less than you are at present, what would you say? And would it feel odd? The same is true, of course, in relation to Mars, the god of war, and the whole world of power, force, ultimately of arms and violence. Our Western culture has simply assumed that the answer to the world's problem is to go and drop bombs on someone. I said 11 years ago, and I've said ever since, that unleashing our modernist military machine on the putative sources of terror in the Middle East was just going to make everything much, much worse. And I've seen nothing in the last decade to make me think I was wrong. But our English-speaking culture, which was brought up, as I was brought up, on the great tales of success in 2 world wars. You know, I grew up with those little comics that you buy as a kid, all about heroes going off and doing the business and coming back either wounded or damaged, but they were the heroes and that's the myth that I was brought up with. But that culture has pushed itself now into the position of being the world's policeman. And however many body bags are brought back home, we still assume that that's how the world ought to work. And experiments like Desmond Tutu's Commission for Truth and Reconciliation in Southern Africa are admired but not imitated. Now, in each of these cases then, Aphrodite and Mammon and Mars, these ancient and well-known gods have not gone away. They've not been banished upstairs. They are present and powerful, and all the more so for being unnamed and so unrecognized. So in what sense are they divine? The ancients would have had no trouble in answering that. First, those who worship gods become like them. Their characters are formed as they imitate the object of worship and imbibe its inner essence. That's a scary thought. But second, worshipping gods demands sacrifices, and those sacrifices are often human. You hardly need me to spell out the point. How many million children, born or indeed unborn, have been sacrificed on the altar of Aphrodite, denied a secure upbringing because the demands of Eros have kept one or both parents on the move? Or how many million lives have been blighted by money, whether by not having it or worse, by having too much of it? And if you think you can't have too much of it, that just shows how deeply mammon worship has soaked into us. And how many people, how many lives are being torn apart as we speak by the incessant demands of power, of violence and war. Now please note, I'm not saying that sex is evil. I'm not saying that money is bad in itself. I'm not even saying that there is never a place for force in defending the weak against violent evil or unjust tyranny. I am neither a killjoy, a Marxist, nor a pacifist. My point is that our society, having claimed to have got rid of God upstairs so that we can simply live our lives the way we want to, corporately and individually, has fallen back into the clutches of forces and energies which are bigger than ourselves, more powerful than the sum total of people who give them allegiance, forces we might as well recognize as gods. Those are just the big and obvious ones. There are other ancient gods still alive and active, the gods of blood and soil, of racial and territorial identities and claims. Most of us are embarrassed to think that that stuff still goes on, but they rear their heads even in our avowedly secular world. And behind them all is a force which we invoke still at every turn, a force assumed by the media in particular, a force called progress. Again and again we hear it on our radios, and I hear it when I come over to your country. Now that we live in the modern world, says the commentator or the chat show host. And that comes as the backup to some argument, usually a secularist argument. Now that we live in the 21st century, people say, as though a change in the calendar meant an automatic updating or upgrading of moral systems and assumptions. Now, you only have to think for a minute to see how ridiculous this is, but people still say it, and worse, they think it, and worse, they assume it. A further moment's thought shows how this integrates with the three major divinities. Western progress means that we now have the technology to send unmanned drones to kill people in Pakistan. What would we think if another power managed to do the equivalent to us? Medical progress enables us to have more sex with more people with less risk, up to a point. So if risk was the only thing stopping us, what's the problem? And electronic financial systems enable us to gamble with zillions of dollars of someone else's money, so why not? And so our brave secularist world lurches to and fro in obedience to impulses which an earlier age would have recognized as divine, but which we, with our late modern Epicureanism, have not named as such, and so have not challenged. Now you may say, what's all this got to do with religion? Many in Western culture, of course, still think of religion as saying prayers, going to church, reading the Bible perhaps, not least living in hope of going to heaven, however vaguely that is expressed. This is a thoroughly modern definition of religion. It wouldn't have been recognized by anyone in the ancient world, or indeed by many today outside the Western world. From ancient times through to the present, religion has had to do with the wider assumed dimensions of ordinary culture, be it marriage or music, politics or city life, wine or war. It's precisely part of our dilemma that we have pulled what we call religion and what we call politics apart. Nobody dreamt of doing that before the 18th century. Oh, there were reasons, wars of religion, wouldn't it be good if we didn't have to do that stuff? Okay, and so that drove the rush to Epicureanism. In fact, it was an unstable philosophy, Epicureanism was in the ancient world. It was better suited to the small number of idle rich who could afford to settle down in comfort. It's been exactly the same in our own world. It is a philosophy for the elite, or those who aspire to be the elite, which is, of course, precisely what the West has done ever since the 18th century. And perhaps the convulsions that we've gone through, the disasters that have come from worshipping Mars and Mammon and Aphrodite, are the signs that the theological vacuum caused by pulling God and the world apart is at last imploding. But do we know what to do under such circumstances? Have we got a roadmap to say, if that happens, this is where you should go next?